Chapter 4. The Universal Solvent. Stanley was at the door of his house, looking very excited when he met Einstein. Stanley's hair flew over his eyes. He wasn't even angry with Einstein for being half an hour late. "This time I've invented something really fantastic," Stanley said. "Come on up to the laboratory and I'll show you, Einstein." Stanley hurried up the stairs. His laboratory was really the attic room that his mum and dad had allowed him to use for his experiments. Einstein, who'd been there many times, knew that it was overflowing with all kinds of, Stanley called it scientific apparatus. When Stanley opened the attic door, the laboratory was in more of a mess than usual. Flasks filled with red, green and blue liquids bubbled away. A maze of glass and plastic tubing connected the beakers one to the other. There was a peculiar smell in the room. Stanley said it was a perfume that he was working on to attract girlfriends, but to Einstein it smelled like a skunk. He decided not to mention this to Stanley, however. At the end of the maze of tubing was a small beaker half filled with a clear red liquid. Stanley pointed to the beaker. "That's it," he said proudly. As he spoke, another drop of red liquid plopped into the beaker. "What is it?" Einstein looked at the beaker curiously. "It looks like a glass of cherry pop to me," which here we would call a soft drink. Stanley laughed in his best imitation of a mad scientist. "It looks like cherry pop," he declared, rubbing his hands together gleefully. "But that liquid is the first universal solvent ever made." "Oh," Einstein said. "That's great. Another one of your important scientific breakthroughs?" "You know what a solvent is, don't you, Einstein?" Without waiting for Einstein to say yes, Stanley explained. A solvent is a liquid that dissolves another substance. For example, water dissolves sugar, salt, and many other things. We call that a solution of sugar, salt, or whatever is dissolved. "I know," said Einstein. "In fact, water is an excellent solvent. Give it enough time and it can dissolve almost anything. You might even call it a kind of universal solvent." "But that's just it," Stanley said in that school teacher voice he sometimes used. "Water doesn't dissolve everything. For example, water doesn't dissolve oil or nail polish. But you can use turpentine to dissolve oil and nail polish remover to dissolve nail polish. There are lots of different solvents for different things, but my solvent dissolves anything." "Right," said Einstein. "Let's see your solvent work." Stanley took a piece of plastic and placed it in the beaker. He stirred it around with a glass rod. It got smaller and smaller. After a few minutes, the piece of plastic had dissolved. Einstein was impressed. He looked closely at the beaker. Stanley looked at Einstein and said, "Would you like me to dissolve your shirt?" "Stanley," Einstein said, "I'd give the shirt off my back for a real scientific breakthrough, but suppose you tried to dissolve some other things first." "What would you like me to dissolve?" Stanley asked. Einstein looked around the laboratory. "Try a piece of chalk." he said, and some linseed oil and some borax. Einstein knew that the chemicals he had chosen were only slightly soluble in water. Sure, Stanley said. He set up 3 more beakers with the red liquid. He dropped the chalk into one beaker and each of the other chemicals into the other 2 beakers. This time it took somewhat longer for anything to happen, but sure enough, the chalk and the chemicals slowly began to dissolve. Einstein looked thoughtful. He picked up each beaker of red liquid and looked at it carefully. Finally, he pushed his glasses back onto his nose and smiled. That cherry pop you made may dissolve lots of things, but I wouldn't go to the patent office just yet. It's not a universal solvent. If it were, you would be in lots of trouble. Can you solve the puzzle? How did Einstein know that Stanley had not invented a universal solvent? And what did he mean by saying that Stanley would be in lots of trouble if he did? What kind of trouble? Asked Stanley. You mean with the government? Not exactly the government, Einstein answered. More like your parents and anyone standing on the floor below us. What are you talking about, Einstein? Just this, Einstein said. A real universal solvent will dissolve anything, even glass. So, if your cherry pop were a universal solvent, it would dissolve the glass beaker and the stirring rod. No container could hold it. It would dissolve anything it touched, including the attic floor and anybody on the floors below as well. Stanley slowly nodded. I suppose you're right, Einstein, he said. Einstein smiled. Look at it this way, he said. It's better to solve a puzzle than to dissolve an attic floor. Okay, time for toilet, teeth, bed, then lights out. 1, 2, 3. Love you, bye.